Hello and welcome to video number 4 of Need to Know British Cultural Studies. Our topic for today is Michel Foucault and discipline. Let's first have a look into the context for today's session, which is basically Michel Foucault, a French philosopher in the 1950s until 1984 when he died, and he also worked as a historian, literary critic, political activist, and was a professor in France. His main arguments focus around the relationship of power and knowledge, and also research concerning social control and power relationships in society. He did this by publishing extensively on, for example, hospitals, the treatment of the mentally ill people in lunatic asylums, knowledge and its relation to power, and also sexuality. His works basically work as enormous case studies which unfold a lot of theories. So, for example, he took the hospital as an example and then worked on how does power and knowledge relate to this context and basically formulated his theories on the basis of several practical examples. And he was extremely influential in the academic discourses of his time and shaped many ideas in academic studies. Foucault views society as a disciplinary society. First, what is discipline? Basically, people behaving according to rules, and this not by repression, but rather by self-control. And according to Foucault, in history, discipline replaced other modes of control over people. Because in nowadays society and from the 19th century onwards, discipline was enforced by the visibility of the subjects which are to be controlled. This means that at a certain point in time, from a feudal hierarchy where a king was in place, and if someone did something wrong in society, this person was mainly killed, and because of that, repression enforced norms. Repression made people follow the rules and rather not they just knew the rules and were visible to everybody, and because of that behaved according to the rules, but rather repression. And then with, for example, the development of the police force and certain architectural norms as well, people were more visible in society. So they could be seen by people who were hierarchically in a superior position. And of course, then they also knew the rules, the constitution, the values, and the norms in society. And because they were watched and visible in the cities or also in the countryside, always and everywhere in society, they follow the rules. And this is something that we have nowadays as well. Examples would be surveillance cameras in the streets, or football games or other games. If you have a game, you have certain rules of the game. And then you have some people who are watching. These can be the players who are watching each other so nobody cheats. And these can also be, for example, in football, referees. And of course, you have an audience. So many people are watching. And because of that, the rules are followed. Because if the rules weren't followed, then there would be penalties. This is the panopticon model. It's the model of an ideal prison, according to Jeremy Bentham, and Foucault uses this as a metaphor for society. But let's have a look at the panopticon model and how it works. The prison is basically separated into cells. You can see them from the outside. All the windows are individual cells, and you can also see them in the plan below. So you have cells which are facing the outside through the windows, so there's constantly light falling in, and they are also facing the center of the building. And in the center of the building, on that little platform which says N in the lower part of the picture, there you have someone standing, a police officer or some prison ward, and this person is in a small building or platform, not on a platform where it's visible, but rather invisible there. So this person can watch all the prisoners in the cells, but without being seen themselves. And because of that, the prisoners in the cells never know if they're watched or not. And of course, they behave as though they were watched all the time because there is the slight possibility that someone is in the center watching their individual cell. This, of course, creates high psychological strain because if you feel watched all the time, then you basically get paranoid very, very quickly. And so this kind of prison is really a stressful situation for the inhabitants, but what they do is they behave extremely disciplined. And Foucault now uses this as a metaphor for modern society because, as we just discussed, Surveillance cameras watch people all the time. You also have glass walls in some offices, so you can see that other people are working and other people can see you working. You have this constant possibility of being watched and watching others. Also in the cities, we have long streets and alleys, because if people are on a long street rather than a narrow and curvy road, then you can watch them from a distance. And also aisles and shops. So if you are in a shop in the city or wherever, you have long and narrow and also straight aisles, and so you can watch people from one certain point, and it is very easy to have an overview of the shop, the city, or everything. Foucault says, quote, that stones can make individuals docile, unquote. This means that the paradigms of seeing and being seen in society change and are built into the stones, built into the architecture of society. And I here have two examples, which are university buildings in England. The red one is the Faculty of Arts building at the University of Warwick, and it is a really new building. And the other one is Christ Church College at the University of Oxford, and a really, really old building built in around 1529. And if you look at the old building first, you can see that it has small windows, and from the outside you can't really know what's going on in the building. So from the outside you are excluded. Also within the building, this is something you can't see here, but the building has smaller rooms and stone walls. This means you cannot very well know what is going on behind the walls, even if you're in the building. Then there are, of course, some large rooms, like the dining hall you can see in the picture. And there you have this relationship of professors sitting on a platform and being able to see these students all the time. So you have this idea of we're watching each other, and it is possible to enforce discipline by that. But it is more of a representative aspect in showing people we're important and you're excluded, and thus creating a hierarchy rather than making people visible all the time. The other building, the Faculty of Arts building in Warwick, is a completely different paradigm. Here you have visibility from the inside and from the outside, because you have large halls, you have glass walls everywhere, light coming in, light falling out of the building, so you constantly, even if you are outside the building, can see people working. And because of that, people of course are in a climate of constant surveillance and are very disciplined when working in this building. Hierarchical observation and normalizing judgment are, according to Foucault, the main strands governing discipline in society. Observation is basically what we just talked about. People watching each other and hierarchies because everyone is constantly seen. Nowadays, we, however, have also different ways than watching people face to face, which enable control. So, for example, if you think about your passport, if you travel abroad, you show your passport, it's scanned, and because of that, people are tracked all over the globe. Also, if you think about health insurance cards, the card you show to your doctor when you go there, it tracks your medical information and distributes that information. Also, paying with card instead of cash, it makes whatever you do trackable for other people, and so it creates a network of visibility or control. And because of that, people, of course, behave according to the rules and are disciplined. But there's one second technique, namely judgment, which is very important, because if people were only watching each other and there would be no consequences, then who would care? So what happens here is that people distinguish into normal and deviant. So the norm is just, the average and nothing special, but something that is deviant is judged. And while doing that, at one hand, you use this norm as a basis for judgment, and on the other hand, you reproduce the norm while applying it. You strengthen the norm while applying it. And because of that, it's called normalizing judgment. And those two techniques go together in the process of the so-called examination. And no, it is no coincidence that, for example, at university, the final tests are called final exams or final examinations, because they are a perfect example of this. When writing an exam, you are observed by the lecturers who look at the students' writing and judge them according to, does this student behave according to the rules and write their paper, or does this student maybe look at other students' papers, which they shouldn't, and then the student will will get punished and maybe disqualified, expelled from the exam. So you have observation and judgment. And also as a second process, then after you handed in your examination, the professors will observe what you do there and then judge it. Judge it according to, is it average and okay, then you will get your credit points. Is it not okay and not what you are supposed to write, then you will not get the credit points. And also, if it is really, really good, then of course your grade will be better. So this judgment is not only normal and worse than the norm, but actually also goes into the direction of better than the norm. So if something is better than the norm, there is a reward for that. Now, we talked about the how of discipline in society via the examination process, but there's also a what. And this is micro penalty and infra penalty. To enforce a norm, a disciplinary penal system is needed. This means you have a system, infra penalty, that establishes rules for behavior, values, and social practices. And these rules are below the law. They define expectations and how things are to be done within the boundaries of the law. So this is not about don't kill people. This is law. This is something that is just not to be done in society. But apart from that, there are certain ideas of what is normal, what is not normal. How should you walk in the streets? How should you behave in a shop? How should you behave in a certain social surrounding? How do you have to behave at school? What are rules of the classroom? What are dress codes? What are manners? So social expectations as a system, and this is infra penalty. And of course, there's also measurements or penalties, so-called micro penalties, which enforce this system. So they are the concrete punishments, and there are no law consequences. So let's go back to the example of manners. If you don't have manners, then nobody will chop your head off. But there are smaller measurements, a weird look, social exclusion, or also conclusions regarding this person. So for example, if you don't have manners and behave rude is a judgment here, rude to another person, then you will have to say sorry, or people will criticize you, or exclude you, or say that you're rude. So these are the penalties in the system of infra penalty. Now, the concept which is associated with Foucault is discourse. Discourse is the organization of knowledge, according to Foucault, and also how this organization of knowledge supports normalization, so the establishment and reproduction of norms through examination and judgment. Now, discourses are, according to Foucault, quote, organized and organizing bodies of knowledge with rules and regulations that govern particular practices like ways of speaking, thinking, and acting, unquote. This sounds complicated, but actually, let's have a look. So let's take the example of the knowledge about the solar system, so how the sun and earth are in constellations and how the whole system works. You have certain knowledge about that. And discourses now are organized and organizing bodies of knowledge. So you have the knowledge, and this knowledge about the solar system is organized in a certain way. You have A, what is true, B, what is not true, and C, what is this object, or what do people think it is? So if we look at the solar system, what can be said? And this is all that we see as true about this idea. So you can say that the sun is in the center, you can say that the Earth as a planet is circling around the sun, that there are other planets. So all that is considered as knowledge or truth about this certain object. Then there are also many things which can't be said. So for example, we can't say that the sun is an orange because the sun is simply not an orange. So this would be wrong. So we have the organization of true and wrong in the discourse. And then, of course, what is perceived to be an object. If we talk about the solar system as the object, then our idea of what is true and what was wrong about this object shapes what we think this object is. So the object, in this case the solar system, is for us in our society what we think is true about the object. So our knowledge shapes what we think the world is like. And you can distinguish into discourse and also discursive formations. The discourse is all knowledge we have about an object, so the solar system or a person like Donald Trump or any other topic, at, and now here comes the specificity, a certain place and a certain time. So now and here we think about the solar system, that it works the way we learned at school. But there were also different discourses because of this place and time specificity. So nowadays, if you look at a certain different country, then there might be a different assumption of what is the solar system, a different discourse with rules of what can be said, what can't be said, and what is this object like for us. And also, if you look back historically, then at certain times you had a different idea about this. And now here goes the idea of the discursive formation. We have different discourses about one object at the same time or about at different times. Or we have different discourses at one time or at one place, and they are in a formation, a network of knowledge that in a way has connections to each other. So if we look at the discursive formation of the solar system, we would say nowadays we have a certain knowledge, a certain assumption, and know certain things about the solar system. And a few hundred years ago, there were different things that were known, different things that were considered to be true. And so the discourse was different. But all these discourses belong to the same discursive formation because they are all about the same basic object, the solar system. Here's a second quote about discourses. They are, quote, social practices in which we engage. They are like social scripts we perform, consciously and unconsciously, unquote. So this goes into the social dimension of a discourse, and let us, for this purpose, use the example of sexuality. Discourses shape ways of thinking, speaking, and behavior in society. So what we consider as truth about sexuality and what is a man, what is a woman, how are people sexually different from each other, or how are they similar, that governs how we think about people in society, how we speak about people's sexuality, and also how we behave in society. Historically speaking, in the Renaissance, so in the 16th, 15th century, there was up to the 18th and 19th century a one-sex model. So basically the idea that humans have one sex, and then if the genitalia were inwards, this was a woman, and outwards, this was a man. And this idea of thinking, this one-sex model, allowed for the establishment of a hierarchy in society because it was said that the genitalia being inwards is basically not how it is supposed to be. So women were imperfect, were not fully developed. And men, however, were perfectly developed because the genitalia were pushed outwards. So you had the idea that you had one sex and how the genitalia were shaped, inwards or outwards, determined if you are man or woman, and also your place in society, because the imperfect woman should, of course, not rule society. So basically, the idea of how does sexuality work, how are people distinguishable into sexes, shaped how people thought about the hierarchy of sexes in society, how there was speaking and also behavior. And so the idea of sexuality based on this knowledge, based on the idea how does it work, what is the knowledge we have, constituted social practices. Now, this changed because in the 18th or 19th century, you had the idea of the two-sex model. There was research and it was discovered that, well, actually, the genitalia of women inside the body are really, really different from what men have out of the body and also inside. So it was no longer sufficient to say there is one sex and the genitalia are either inward or outwards. Now you had the two-sex model. And now what happened was this hierarchy of men as superior to women was tried to be upheld. So people, in a way, shaped medical knowledge or conducted research and tried to find arguments why, because men and women were different, men should be the rulers and women were deficient. So, for example, what is a very prominent discourse in that time is the discourse of hysteria. So, women were considered as hysteric and very prone to have hysteria, which was seen as mental capacities which were dysfunctional and also a possibility of saying women are not as good as men. And this diagnosis, hysteria, was a primarily female diagnosis. So women were said to be hysteric and because of that, not as good as men, and so men could rule the world still. And then you had gender equality as change that was eventually happening. So women took up their rights, spoke for their rights, and now we are developing into society where gender is more or less equal. There's, of course, still the gender pay gap, but in principle, it is said that although they are sexually different, men and women are in a way equals, and none of them is distinctly worse than the other or hierarchically higher or lower than the other. And this idea of what is our discourse, what is our knowledge about sexes, about sexuality, about people in this sense at a certain point in time, it shapes how people think about each other and others, how they speak about each other and others, and also how they behave in society. So it shapes the hierarchies. So this means that discourses in a way have power over social practices. What is known shapes what can happen in society. They establish norms and so-called truths at a certain point in time. And they establish so-called regimes of truth because of this relationship of power and knowledge. Because what is considered to be true is what governs society. It's the hegemonic belief, if we want to go back to Bourdieu's hegemony. And now, no, it's Althusser's hegemony, sorry. And so the truth, in a way, what is seen as truth governs what happens in society, how people think, speak, and behave in society. Now, this was a lot of information, and you can definitely take some time to process that, rewatch things, and try to really trace the examples for yourself. But here's a further application and revision example. That's a picture of the British Museum in London, and now I have compiled a few tasks. So think of visitors in a building like this. What norms and rules do we have, and how are they enforced? And also, how does a museum like this contribute to knowledge distribution? That now goes to discourse. How is discourse established and also mediated in a museum like that? Think of history, objects, and all that happens in the museum and surrounding it. Now, these tasks can be applied to the British Museum. You can look at the picture. You can also, of course, Google the museum and find more information and try to think of how these tasks apply to the museum in order to revisit what we just discussed in the session. I will now give some ideas. So if you want to do the tasks, maybe stop the video here and watch the ideas after you've done the task, because I don't want to give spoilers, of course. So if you're a visitor in a building like this, norms and rules would be, for example, you have to be silent. You don't touch the objects. There are certain pathways and certain tickets you have to buy, or in the British Museum, you just have to get the ticket. It's for free because it's one of the official museums. But you have to have certain tickets, have to obey the rules of not eating, silence. So you have certain ideas of how should you behave and what's not supposed to be done. And these rules are enforced through visibility, of course, and through judgment. So if you behave according to the rules and are seen by the security guards or seen by other visitors, or if you also are heard by other visitors, if it's about silence, then everything's okay if you behave according to the rules. And if you don't, you might get punished by a weird look, by a shh, or maybe also by a safety guard or security guard just pulling you out of the building if you behave too badly. Now, how does a museum like this contribute to knowledge distribution? In a museum, you of course have a certain idea of knowledge portrayed. In the history of the museum, in objects in the museum, also the labels which are written. So what is told to you in a museum via the objects and what is said or written about them is one certain idea of knowledge, one discourse that is distributed and mediated. So the museum in a way provides you with knowledge or the possibility to search for knowledge. And this in a way that refuels or fuels one certain discourse or certain discursive formations. And so how the objects are presented, what you can read about them, shapes one idea of knowledge, and it can change over time. And there are also, especially with regard to the British Museum, controversies. I mean, it is the British Museum, but it has objects from all over the world. because in the colonial times and the Brits had an empire, they could just go somewhere and take the objects from other cultures, and now they present these cultures in the British Museum. Of course, they don't present them as this is British culture, but they present them as the British preserved these objects. The British have these objects, and now there are controversies about, is this okay? Should the British Museum not give back the objects? So you have certain contentions with the changing discourse over time. And now, with these thoughts, I want to say thank you for listening, and yeah, here are the sources, and yeah, I see you in the next video.